Most people only see the waving hands, the polished smiles, the perfectly pressed uniforms, and the careful words spoken through microphones. They see the palace gates and the horses and the flags, and they think they understand what it means to be royal. But what they almost never see, what almost no one ever gets to see, is what happens in the quiet space between duty and truth. What happens when two people who carry the weight of an entire nation on their shoulders finally decide that they are done pretending that everything is fine. This is that story, and it begins not with a crown, not with a ceremony, not with the roar of a crowd, but with a conversation that no one was supposed to hear. There are moments in history that do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with trumpets or with breaking news banners scrolling across television screens. They come quietly, almost gently, like a tide that has been building for years before it finally reaches the shore. The moment when William, Prince of Wales, now King William, and Catherine, his wife, his partner, his queen, chose to step forward together for the first time in a way that was genuinely, undeniably, breathtakingly real, was exactly that kind of moment. It did not feel like history when it was happening. It felt like something far more simple and far more powerful than that. It felt like honesty. To understand what made that moment so remarkable, you have to understand where they had come from. Not just in terms of geography or palace walls or the particular brand of silence that settles over royal households when something important is being left unsaid, but in terms of who they were as people before the world decided what they were supposed to be. William had grown up in the brightest, harshest spotlight that modern celebrity had ever produced. He had lost his mother at an age when most children are still learning the rules of the playground, and he had done his grieving in full view of hundreds of millions of strangers who felt that his grief belonged to them as much as it belonged to him. That kind of childhood does not produce ordinary adults. It produces people who are extraordinarily careful, who have learned that the world is always watching, who understand that a single unguarded expression caught by a camera lens can become the defining image of a decade. Catherine had come from a different kind of life, though the gap was not as wide as the tabloids liked to pretend. She had grown up in a family that was comfortable and warm and deeply committed to one another, a family that did things together, ski trips and camping and Sunday dinners where everyone actually talked to each other. She had learned from her parents what a solid, loving partnership looked like from the inside, and that knowledge had stayed with her even when the world around her became something that no amount of growing up in Berkshire could have prepared her for. She was practical in a way that royals rarely get credit for being. She was steady. She could read a room and she could read a person, and over the years she had become extraordinarily good at reading William. Not the William who appeared in official photographs, not the William who gave carefully worded speeches about environmental sustainability and the importance of mental health, but the William who got tired and frustrated and occasionally needed someone to tell him that whatever he was spiraling about at midnight was not actually the crisis he had convinced himself it was. They had met at university, which was one of those facts that sounded almost too neat, too storybook to be real. But the meeting itself had been ordinary in the best possible way, a moment in a hallway, a mutual friend, an introduction that neither of them would have been able to predict would eventually reshape both of their lives entirely. What is often overlooked in the retelling of that early period is how long they took, how patient they were, how they built something slowly, carefully, with the kind of attention that suggests they both understood, even then, that what they were constructing would need to hold weight that most relationships never have to bear. There were breaks and complications, and the particular misery of being separated from someone you care about while the whole country watches and speculates and forms opinions about your private life that they publish in national newspapers. They endured all of that. They came through it. And what emerged on the other side was not the fairy tale that the press preferred to sell, but something more durable than that. A real friendship between two real people who happened to also be in love with each other. The wedding, when it came, was watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. The footage played on screens in living rooms and offices and hospital waiting areas and pubs across Britain and beyond. People stood in the cold outside Westminster Abbey just to be near the event, even though they could not see inside, even though what they were really standing near was the idea of the thing rather than the thing itself. Catherine walked up the aisle in a dress that became one of the most discussed garments in the history of fashion journalism, and William waited for her with an expression on his face that was not the carefully managed expression of a royal performing his function, but something more unguarded, something that people recognized because they had felt it themselves. That particular combination of disbelief and gratitude that hits you when you realize that the person walking toward you is actually choosing you. But the wedding was not the beginning of the story. It was not even really the beginning of what they would eventually become together. It was a moment that the world witnessed, a door that opened into a life that was mostly private, mostly quiet in its important details, and mostly theirs, even when it did not feel that way. The years that followed were years of learning, of adjustment, of discovering what it actually meant to run a household and raise children and carry out royal duties, and maintain your individual identity and your relationship with your partner all at the same time, while the newspaper headlines spun stories about you that you were not permitted to correct. George arrived first, and then Charlotte, and then Louis, and with each child the nature of the family that William and Catherine were building became clearer. Not the sanitized, formal version of royal family that had existed in the public imagination for generations, but something warmer and more modern and more deliberately chosen. There were photographs that became famous not because of the occasion they documented, but because of what was happening at the edges of them. Children laughing at something just off camera, parents exchanging a glance that meant something specific and private between them, the particular relaxed physicality of people who are genuinely comfortable with each other. People noticed. People noticed that something about this family was different from what they had been trained to expect from the palace. It was during those years of building and growing and quietly becoming that the harder chapters were also being written. The relationship between William and his brother Harry had been one of the most publicly discussed fraternal bonds in the world, and its deterioration was documented in real time with a thoroughness that was as painful to watch as it was impossible to look away from. There were interviews and books and allegations and counter-allegations, and a sustained period during which it felt as though the family that had always been presented as a symbol of British stability was quietly, irreversibly fracturing. William and Catherine navigated all of it. They said what they were able to say, and they stayed silent about what they were not able to say, and they continued showing up at events and engagements and charity visits and hospital openings, looking composed in the way that people look composed when they have had a great deal of practice at not falling apart in public. And then came something that no amount of practice could fully prepare either of them for. The illness, Catherine's diagnosis, the cancer that she revealed publicly in a video message that was watched by an extraordinary number of people in an extraordinarily short period of time, landed in the middle of the country's consciousness with the force of something genuinely unexpected. Not because illness itself is unexpected, but because the particular quality of her honesty in that moment was unexpected. She sat in front of a camera, and she told the truth about what was happening in her body and what it had cost her to get to that point, and the country, and much of the world, responded with something that was not the usual mixture of fascination and speculation that tends to follow royal news, but with something closer to genuine, personal concern. People felt it. They felt it in a way that surprised many of them, including people who had never considered themselves particularly interested in royal affairs. William was beside her through all of it. That is the sentence that summarizes what is, in reality, a much longer and more complicated and more private truth. Being beside someone through serious illness is not a simple thing. It is not a position you hold the way you hold a ceremonial title. It requires a continuous series of choices about where to put your fear so that it does not become the other person's burden to carry. It requires the ability to be present and functional and reliable in the moments when what you most want to do is go somewhere quiet and fall apart completely. It requires the kind of love that is not the shining, cinematic version of love, but the quieter, heavier, more determined version. The kind that shows up on the ordinary days and the terrible days and the days that are somehow both at once. He managed the children's schedule and his own public duties and the private management of his own anxiety and the very particular grief of watching someone you love be unwell. All of this at the same time, with the additional weight of knowing that millions of people were watching and caring and hoping, and that the caring and hoping of millions of strangers, while genuinely kind, is also a kind of pressure. He handled it. Not perfectly, no one handles something like that perfectly, but with the kind of sustained, deliberate care that speaks to who he is as a person when there are no cameras to perform for. And Catherine handled it in a way that became its own kind of instruction. She went quiet when she needed to be quiet. She stepped back from her duties without apology or explanation beyond what was necessary and true. She let herself be cared for, which is harder than it sounds for someone who has spent years being the person who holds things together. She gave herself permission to be a patient rather than a princess, a mother rather than a public figure, a person rather than a symbol. And when the time came, when the treatment was done and the hardest part had passed, and she was ready to return, she did not return quietly. She did not slip back into her role as though nothing had happened and hope that people would take her lead and pretend along with her. She came back with the full weight of what she had been through visible in how she spoke about it, and that decision, that choice to be seen honestly rather than perfectly, changed something in the way the country understood her. It was in the aftermath of all of this that the moment came, the moment that this story is really about. The moment when William and Catherine stepped forward together in a way that was not choreographed by a palace communications team, not arranged for maximum political or diplomatic effect, not managed in the careful, hedged way that so much of royal public life is managed. They stepped forward because something needed to be said, and because they were the right people to say it, and because after everything, the grief and the illness and the family fractures, and the years of learning how to be themselves inside a role that was designed by history to make that almost impossible, they had arrived somewhere that felt, for perhaps the first time, genuinely solid beneath their feet. What they stepped forward to address was not a single issue, but an accumulation of things: the mental health of the nation, the particular loneliness of people who are struggling in silence, the gap between what public life looks like from the outside and what private life feels like from the inside. They spoke about it not in the careful, distanced language of official statements, but in the language of people who know what they are talking about from personal experience. William spoke about his own grief, about the years of carrying loss that he had never fully processed, about the moment he finally understood that refusing to ask for help was not strength, but its opposite. Catherine spoke about the fear that had lived inside her during her illness, and the unexpected grace of the people around her, and the strange, uncomfortable gift of being forced to slow down and pay attention to what actually mattered. Together in that room on that day, speaking to an audience that included both cameras and people who had come specifically because they needed to hear exactly what was being said, they were something that royals are almost never permitted to be in public. They were vulnerable. Not strategically vulnerable, not performatively vulnerable in the carefully calibrated way that public figures sometimes present vulnerability as a kind of brand, but genuinely, quietly, honestly open in a way that made the people in the room feel less alone in their own lives. That was the beginning of what would become something larger than a single event. But in that first moment, before the coverage and the commentary and the inevitable second-guessing that follows any royal action of significance, in that first moment, it was just two people who had been through a great deal together choosing to be honest about it in a room full of strangers. And something about that simple, human choice made it feel like the most significant thing either of them had done in years. The room they were in was not grand in the way that royal venues typically are. It was a community hall in the kind of town that does not normally receive royal visits, selected not for its architecture or its history, but for the specific reason that the people there, the ones who had shown up that morning wondering if the visit would feel as distant and formal as they half expected, were exactly the people William and Catherine wanted to be in the room with: working people, people managing difficult things quietly, people who would recognize honesty when they heard it because they had learned, through necessity, to be honest with themselves about what they were carrying. The drive there had been quiet. Not an uncomfortable quiet, not the silence of two people avoiding something, but the particular shared quiet of two people who have been through enough together that silence is not a gap to be filled, but a space they can simply exist in. Catherine had looked out the window at the countryside going past, and William had done the same on his side, and somewhere in that shared watching of the world moving by, something had settled between them. A readiness. Not certainty, neither of them has ever been certain, not about this kind of thing, but something close enough to it to take the next step. The hall had been arranged simply. Rows of chairs faced a small raised platform, and the platform held nothing ceremonial. No lecterns draped in velvet, no formal seating arrangements designed to communicate hierarchy through the precise positioning of chairs. There was a low table with 2 seats facing the audience, and between those seats a glass of water each, and beyond that, nothing. The simplicity of it was itself a kind of statement. It said, "We are not here to perform, we are here to talk." People had arrived in ones and twos, some of them looking uncertain, unsure of what they were supposed to do with themselves in a setting that was both entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary. The woman who ran the local bereavement support group had been invited. So had a man who had spent 3 years dealing with crippling anxiety after losing his job, and a young mother who had spoken publicly about the loneliness of the postnatal period, and a retired teacher who had quietly supported dozens of students through mental health crises over a 40-year career without ever being asked how she herself was coping. These were not famous people. They were not there to provide a backdrop. They were there because they were the people this conversation was for, and William and Catherine had been very specific about that when the event was being planned. Not a press opportunity, not a charity launch, a conversation, a real one. When William and Catherine came in, there was no announcement, no fanfare. They walked in through the side door the way anyone might walk into a community hall, a little quickly, with the slight purposefulness of people who are aware that they are slightly late and do not want to make it worse. Catherine was wearing something simple and quiet in color, the kind of outfit that reads as considered without demanding attention. William was in a jacket without a tie, which for a senior royal in an official setting was still, even now, a small but deliberate signal. "I am not here to be formal with you." They both smiled when they came in, and the smiles were not the fixed, managed expressions of public duty, but the kind that appears when you look around a room and feel, unexpectedly, that you are in the right place. The conversation that followed was moderated, but only loosely. There was a woman from the organization that had helped arrange the event who occasionally offered a gentle redirect when the discussion seemed to be settling into safer territory than any of them had come for. But mostly what happened in that hall for the next hour and a half was something that was difficult to describe without reaching for words that sound overwrought but are simply accurate. It was honest. It was genuinely, uncomplicatedly honest in a way that formal royal engagement almost never is. Because formal royal engagement is designed to convey certain things and avoid conveying others, and what was happening in that room had no such design. It had only intention. The intention to say true things in a place where true things needed to be said. William spoke first. He spoke about his mother, not carefully, not with the guarded acknowledgement that he typically permitted himself in public settings, but with the kind of direct, present-tense grief that reminded everyone listening that the loss of Diana was not a chapter from his biography that he had read and processed, and set down, but something that still lived in him every day, in ways that he had spent years learning to understand and had not always succeeded. He said that there had been a long period during which he had believed that not talking about her was a form of protecting her memory, as though grief, if not given language, could be contained and controlled, and kept from becoming the kind of thing that spills out sideways into everything else. He had learned that this was not how grief worked. He had learned it slowly, and he had learned it partly through watching what happened when he finally did talk, when he finally let the feeling have words, and discovered that the world did not end. That the people who heard him did not become overwhelmed or burdened or uncomfortable in the ways he had feared. That actually, sometimes, the opposite happened. That sometimes someone would come up to him after an event and say, in a very quiet voice, that what he had said had given them permission to say something they had been carrying alone for years. The room was very still when he said this, not the polite stillness of an audience waiting for a speaker to finish, but the stillness of people who have heard something that has landed in a personal place. The woman from the bereavement group had her hands folded tightly in her lap. The retired teacher was looking at the floor. The young mother with the postnatal story was looking directly at William with an expression that was not celebrity recognition, but something closer to relief. The particular relief of being in a room where the thing you have been through is being taken seriously by someone who clearly understands the weight of it. Then Catherine spoke, and what she said and the way she said it was something that the people in that room would describe afterward to partners and friends and journalists and anyone who asked, in terms that were remarkably consistent, despite the fact that they were all describing the same thing from different vantage points. They said it felt like someone telling the truth, not a celebrity's truth, carefully packaged for public consumption. Not the truth of a woman performing courage for the cameras, just truth, the real and specific and sometimes uncomfortable kind. She spoke about the period before her diagnosis, when she had known that something was wrong but the knowing had not yet become certainty, and how that particular stretch of time, the waiting and the testing and the not yet knowing, had been in some ways harder than what came after. Because once you know a thing, even a frightening thing, you can begin to move toward it. You can begin to make decisions. What you cannot do anything with is the not knowing, the space in which fear operates without a target, filling every quiet moment with possibilities you cannot think your way through or around. She had lain awake at night during that period and done the thing that everyone does when they are frightened and the lights are off, which is imagine the worst outcomes. She had done this without telling William, because her instinct had been to protect him from the worry until there was something concrete to worry about. And she had learned, she said, that this instinct, which is a kind and loving one, is also a lonely one. That the attempt to carry something alone in order to spare someone else the weight of it does not actually spare them anything in the end. It just means that two people are carrying it separately instead of one weight being held between them. William, sitting beside her, did not look away while she said this. He was watching her with the full attention of someone who has heard this account before, but finds it no less affecting for the familiarity. At one point, when she described those early nights of not knowing, he reached across and briefly held her hand, not for the cameras, not as a gesture staged to communicate solidarity, but in the unconscious way that people reach for each other when something true is being said. It lasted only a few seconds. But several of the people in the room would mention it later when they described what they had witnessed, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so clearly not performed that it became, in its very ordinariness, the thing they remembered most. The questions from the audience were open and honest in the way that audiences sometimes become when the people at the front of the room have first demonstrated that honesty is permitted. The woman from the bereavement group asked about the specific challenge of grief that has a public dimension, grief that other people feel entitled to hold and discuss and form opinions about. William answered carefully, and then, abandoning the careful answer, said something simpler. That the hardest part was not the public attention, which he had learned over decades to separate from himself to some degree, but the moments when the public attention made it harder for the people closest to him to be honest about how they were feeling, because they were aware that their feelings, if expressed, might find their way into print and be reinterpreted and misrepresented in ways that were beyond anyone's control. That the cost of living in full public view was not always what it was assumed to be from the outside, which tended to focus on the privilege. The real cost was more personal than that. The real cost was in the small dailiness of it, the accumulated weight of never being entirely off. Catherine added something to this that was quiet enough that people at the back of the room had to lean forward slightly to hear it. She said that one of the things she had discovered during her illness was that the public and the private are not actually separate in the way she had always tried to keep them, that they bleed into each other, that the version of yourself you present to the world will, eventually, begin to be the version of yourself you believe yourself to be, and that this is a danger. That the practice of being honest in private, with the people who matter to you, is not just a personal preference but a form of maintenance, a way of staying connected to what is real. She had learned this, she said, at a cost. She had learned it by losing the thread for a while and discovering how disorienting that was, how strange it was to look in a mirror during a particularly difficult week of treatment and not quite recognize the person looking back. And how it was not the medical staff, skilled and dedicated as they were, but the people she loved, and William, specifically, though she said this with a sideways look at him that made people in the room laugh softly, who had handed her back herself when she could not quite locate it on her own. There is a particular thing that happens in rooms where genuine things are being said, and it happened in this room. It is not a dramatic thing. It does not look like what it is. What it looks like is simply that people stop fidgeting. The small, constant adjustments of posture and position, and the checking of phones that constitute the background noise of any public gathering, all of that just stops. People sit still. They stop preparing what they are going to say next and simply listen to what is being said. It is the most natural thing in the world, and it is also, in a setting like this one, almost never what happens. The fact that it was happening was itself a measure of something, of the quality of what was being offered at the front of the room, and of the hunger that the people listening had brought with them without necessarily knowing they were bringing it. Midway through the event, a young man in the third row asked a question that shifted the tone slightly, not uncomfortably, but in the direction of something more personal. He was in his late 20s, visibly nervous, holding a printed-out piece of paper as though he had written the question down in advance and was afraid of losing it. He asked William directly, what was the moment, the specific moment, when he realized that he needed to do something different? Not just in terms of public advocacy around mental health, but in his own life. What was the moment when he understood that the way he had been managing things was not actually managing things? William was quiet for a moment. Not the managed pause of someone choosing the right words for a speech, but the genuine pause of someone reaching back for something true. And then he said that it had not been a dramatic moment. It had not been a breakdown or a crisis or a night when everything came apart. It had been an ordinary evening, the children in bed, the house quiet, some obligation or another completed, when he had sat down and felt very specifically that he was not sure who he was when he was not doing something. That the person who existed in the spaces between the duties and the engagements and the public functions was a person he had not spent very much time getting to know. And that this was a problem. Not a catastrophic one, but a real one. The kind that does not resolve itself without attention. He had started from that ordinary evening, that quiet, unremarkable Wednesday or Thursday or whatever it had been, and begun, slowly and with a great deal of help from the people around him, to do something about it. Catherine was nodding while he spoke. She had heard this before, this specific telling of this specific thing, but her nodding was not the automatic nodding of someone who has stopped actually listening. It was the active, present nodding of someone who recognizes the truth in what they are hearing and wants the person speaking to know that the recognition is there. Between two people who have been through what they have been through, that kind of sustained, present attention is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite a lot. The afternoon moved on, more questions. More answers that did not always wrap neatly into the kinds of conclusions that people expect from public figures speaking about personal subjects, the tidy resolution, the lesson clearly labeled and presented for easy takeaway. What William and Catherine offered instead was something messier and more honest than that. They offered the ongoing nature of the work. The fact that you do not resolve grief or manage anxiety or recover from illness and then never think about it again. You come back to it. You continue. You have good periods and difficult ones. You learn things and then you have to relearn them because knowing a thing and living it consistently are two very different challenges. They talked about their children, carefully, with the particular protectiveness that both of them have always maintained around the lives of their kids, but enough to make clear that raising children, while carrying the weight that they carry, has required them to think very carefully about what they model. About what it looks like to George and Charlotte and Louis when the adults in their lives handle difficulty. About whether those children are growing up in a household where feelings are something to be managed and contained or something that can be expressed and worked through. It was not a perfect event. Nothing real is perfect. There were moments of awkwardness, a question that landed in a direction no one had anticipated, a pause that went on slightly too long, a moment when Catherine's voice caught on something she had not expected to catch on, and she stopped and collected herself, and the room gave her the space to do that without filling the silence. Those imperfect moments were not failures. They were the cost of doing something real, of choosing honest over polished, and everyone in the room understood that and met it accordingly. By the time the formal part of the afternoon was over and people began to move into the less structured portion of the visit, tea and conversation, the kind of mingling that tends to follow events like this, something had shifted in the room in a way that was almost tangible. People were talking to each other. Not the careful small talk of strangers who have been placed together by circumstance, but something more substantial, the conversations of people who have just spent an hour and a half in the presence of something honest, and have found, perhaps to their own surprise, that it has made them want to be honest too. The woman from the bereavement group was in deep conversation with the retired teacher. The young man who had asked the question about the specific moment was talking to a member of William and Catherine's team with the focused intensity of someone who has found, unexpectedly, a conversation that matters to them. William moved through the room without the customary buffer of a large security presence keeping people at a careful distance. He talked to people, not the ceremonial brief exchange of a royal walkabout, a few words, a handshake, move on but actual conversations. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He stayed with people longer than protocol typically permits. At one point, he was in a corner of the room talking to the retired teacher for nearly 15 minutes while Catherine, across the room, was doing the same with a small group that included the young mother with the postnatal story and two other women who had come together and who had, it emerged, met each other through a support group they were both still attending. Catherine listened to people the way she always has, with her full attention, without the slightly glazed quality that sometimes settles over people in public life, who have been listening to other people's stories for a long time and have quietly learned to be present in body while retreating somewhere more private in mind. She has not learned that retreat. She listens with her eyes and her expression and the small adjustments of posture that communicate without words that what you are saying is landing. People who have met her in settings like this one consistently report the same thing afterward, that they felt heard. Not managed, not processed, not moved efficiently through a schedule heard. In the way that most of us go through most of our days quietly hoping to be heard and not quite finding it. Outside, the afternoon light was doing the thing that English afternoon light does in a particular season, going golden and long-shadowed in a way that makes even ordinary things look briefly significant. A few people had gathered beyond the hall, not the large crowd that appears at official engagements, but a quieter gathering of local people who had heard that something was happening and come to see, without quite knowing what they expected to find. When William and Catherine came out, there was a moment of slightly uncertain adjustment on both sides, the people outside recalibrating their expectations of formality, the two of them reading the mood of the small gathering and deciding, apparently simultaneously and without needing to discuss it, that what the moment called for was the same thing the afternoon had called for: simplicity, presence. A willingness to be in the actual place they were in rather than the ceremonial version of it. They stayed longer than the schedule had allowed for. This is not unusual for William and Catherine. Both of them have a tendency to run over time at events where the people and the conversations turn out to be more than the plan on paper had anticipated. But on this occasion, the overschedule was more significant than usual, because what was happening outside the hall, in the golden light of that afternoon, had taken on a quality that neither of them seemed willing to walk away from before it was finished. There was a boy, 11 or 12 years old, brought along by a parent who had not been sure whether it was appropriate to bring him, and had decided in the end that it was better to let him see, who had been standing at the edge of the small gathering with the careful, watchful posture of a child who has learned not to take up too much space. William noticed him. He walked over and he crouched down slightly, and he said hello in the direct and unpatronizing way that children respond to, and whatever passed between them in the next few minutes was quiet enough that the people nearby could not hear it. But when William stood up again and moved back toward Catherine, the boy was standing differently, straighter, with the particular quality of someone who has just been told, something that has rearranged a small but important thing inside them. Catherine had seen it from across the small gathering. She often notices the things that are happening at the edges of official visits, the person who has not quite worked up the courage to approach, the child who wants to say something and doesn't know if they're allowed to, the elderly person at the back who has made the effort to come and is not sure whether anyone has noticed. She has a talent for peripheries, for the margins of the room, and it is a talent that is partly temperamental and partly the result of many years of paying attention. She moved through the afternoon with a quality of presence that is genuinely difficult to manufacture and genuinely valuable. The quality of a person who is actually here, in this specific place, with these specific people, rather than somewhere else in their mind, processing and planning and preparing for the next thing. The drive back was quieter than the drive there had been. Not heavy, quiet in the way of people who have spent themselves genuinely and are resting in the aftermath of that. Catherine leaned her head against the window at one point, and William said something low and private that made her laugh. A short, real laugh, unguarded, the kind that is the best possible evidence of a long and genuine intimacy. They did not debrief the event in the analytical, critical mode that both of them are capable of when they are assessing how something has gone. They let it sit. They let it be what it had been, which was something good, something real, something that had required something from them and had given something back. In the days that followed, the coverage was extensive. This was expected. Any royal engagement of substance generates coverage, and this engagement had been unusual enough in its format and its content that the media appetite for it was predictably significant. But what was less expected, or perhaps what surprised people who had expected the coverage to follow the usual pattern of royal reporting, was the quality of the response that came from outside the media. from ordinary people who had watched the footage or read the accounts or been told about it by someone who had been there. The response was not the adoration that sometimes follows royal events, that reflexive, uncritical warmth that is about the idea of royalty rather than the specific reality of the people who embody it. It was something more precise than that. People were responding to the specific things that had been said and the specific way they had been said. They were responding to the recognition of something true. Letters came. They come to the palace regularly, thousands of them, from people all over the world about all kinds of things. But in the period following that visit, the volume and the character of the letters was notably different from the usual flow. People wrote about their own grief, grief that had no public dimension, grief that nobody had ever made a speech about, grief that had simply lived quietly inside them for years without ever being given the language it needed. People wrote about illness, about fear, about the experience of being unwell in a body that felt unfamiliar and a world that did not slow down to wait while you found your way back to yourself. People wrote about loneliness, not the dramatic, crisis-level loneliness that makes headlines, but the ordinary, daily loneliness of feeling that you are moving through your life without anyone who really sees what is happening inside it. William and Catherine read the letters. Not all of them, practically. The volume makes that impossible, but a significant proportion, and they read them with the attention of people who understand that a letter is a kind of trust. That the person who has taken the time to write down something true and personal and difficult and put it into an envelope and send it to an address they have never been to, with no guarantee that anyone will ever actually read what they have written. That person is doing something that deserves to be honored by genuine attention rather than a form reply. They responded personally to some of them. They passed others to the organizations and charities that were better equipped than a palace to provide the specific kind of support the letter was reaching toward. They did not treat the letters as evidence of their own success or as a metric of public approval. They treated them as what they were, a conversation, begun in a community hall in a quiet town, that was continuing in living rooms and bedrooms and kitchen tables all over the country, between strangers who had been given, by that afternoon, a kind of permission they had not known they were waiting for. What had changed? This is the question that the event kept raising in the coverage and the commentary and the conversations that followed it. Had anything actually changed? Had two people sitting in a hall and talking honestly about difficult things done anything beyond generate a news cycle and a volume of positive letters? The answer, which was genuinely uncertain and genuinely worth sitting with, was both yes and no. In terms of policy, nothing had changed. In terms of the structural challenges facing mental health provision in Britain, the waiting lists, the underfunding, the gaps in provision for the specific groups who most needed support, nothing was different the morning after than it had been the morning before. Those problems were larger than one afternoon, and both William and Catherine would have been the first to say so. But something had changed in a different register, in the register of what is possible to say in public. In the register of what it looks like when people who occupy positions of significant public visibility choose to use that visibility for something other than the careful management of their own image. The word that kept appearing in the responses, in the letters, in the media commentary, in the conversations people reported having with each other afterward, was permission. People felt that something they had known privately but had not felt free to express in any wider context had been given permission to exist in the larger world. That the things they carried, the grief, the fear, the loneliness, the sense of existing at some distance from the people around them, were not, after all, as isolating as they had felt. That other people carried them too. That even people who lived in palaces and had titles, and appeared on state occasions in ceremonial dress carried things, that did not go away simply because you were wearing the right outfit or standing in the right room. For William specifically, the event marked something that people who had followed his public life for a long time were able to identify even if they could not always name it. It marked a point at which the person he actually was had become more consistently visible than the role he was required to perform. This is not a simple distinction. The role is real, the obligations are real, the duties are real. The responsibility that comes with his position is not something he takes lightly or performs casually. But for much of his adult life, the role had been something he wore as a kind of armor, and what was happening now, gradually, unevenly, with the occasional step backward, was that he was learning to carry the responsibility without the armor, to be accountable to his position without disappearing into it, to be king and also to be himself, and to trust that these two things were not actually in competition, even when it felt that way. Catherine's transformation, if it could be called that, had been different in shape but similar in direction. She had always been steadier than William in her public self, less volatile in her reactions, more consistent in how she presented. But steady is not the same as settled, and for a long time what she had offered the world was a version of herself that was composed and capable and warm, but not entirely whole. The illness had changed that not by breaking her, which it had not done, but by stripping away the particular kind of performance that comes from never allowing yourself to be seen as anything less than perfectly all right. She had been seen as less than perfectly all right. The country had watched her disappear for a while, and then watched her come back. And in the watching they had recognized something that connected them to her in a way that the years of polished public appearances had not quite managed. They had recognized the experience of being unwell and frightened, and finding their way through. And she had stood in front of them, after all of it, and told them the truth about what it had been like. And that truth had mattered. It had mattered in the specific, personal, difficult-to-quantify way that truth always matters when it is offered honestly and received well. Together, and it is the together that is really the point of this story, the specific and irreducible fact of the two of them, they had arrived at something that looked, from the outside, like a new chapter. But from the inside, which is the only angle from which these things can actually be understood, it was less like a new chapter and more like a fuller version of the same ongoing story. A version in which more of the actual content of their lives was visible. In which the gap between who they were in private and who they were permitted to be in public had narrowed enough to feel livable rather than exhausting. In which the thing they had built together over decades, the partnership, the friendship, the shared understanding of what the work required and what it cost, was finally being offered to the world in a form that was close enough to real to be genuinely useful. Because that is what William and Catherine have always been most concerned with, underneath all the protocols and the titles and the managed public persona. They have always been concerned with usefulness. Not the abstract, institutional usefulness of the monarchy as a symbol or a tourist attraction or a continuity of tradition, but the immediate, direct, human usefulness of being in a position to say and do things that can make a difference to the specific individual people who are on the receiving end of them. The question they have both asked, in different ways and with different vocabularies, throughout their adult lives is, what is this for? What is all of this, the visibility, the position, the access, the platform, actually for, if not to make it possible to do something that matters? The answer they arrived at together, and that the afternoon in that community hall expressed as clearly as anything they had done in their public lives to that point, was not complicated. It was, in the end, almost embarrassingly simple. The thing it is for is connection. The thing the position makes possible, if you are willing to use it honestly, is the reduction of the particular kind of distance that exists between people who have power and people who do not the material distance, which is real and large and not resolved by a single afternoon, but the human distance. The distance between one person's private experience and another person's private experience. The recognition that the internal landscape of being human does not change simply because the external landscape is different. That the woman who runs a bereavement group in a town that doesn't receive royal visits, and the man who will one day be King of England, can sit in the same room and discover that what they carry, while different in almost every particular, is not as different in its essential quality as the world sometimes makes it appear. The months that followed the event were active ones. The conversation that had begun in that hall continued to expand, in the organized and deliberate way that things expand when two people with significant resources and genuine intent choose to invest those resources in something they care about. New partnerships were formed with organizations working in mental health and grief support and community connection. Events were held, not all of them as intimate as that first one, some of them larger and more formal with all the logistical complexity that comes with greater scale, but all of them inflected by the same underlying principle, that the work was real, that the conversations were real, that the point was not to manage public perception but to actually do something. William threw himself into it with an energy and a focus that people who had observed him carefully over the years recognized as characteristic. He does not do things by halves when he is genuinely committed to them, but also with a quality that was newer, a willingness to be changed by what he encountered. To come away from conversations not with his existing views confirmed but with his understanding enlarged, which is rarer and more valuable, and requires a particular kind of intellectual humility that is not always easy to maintain when you are also required to be decisive and authoritative and clear. He was learning to hold those two things at the same time, the sureness of position and the openness to being wrong, the authority of role and the curiosity of person. It was ongoing work. He was still doing it. Catherine moved through this period with the particular quality that her illness had given her, which was a kind of urgency that was not anxious but grateful. She had spent time on the other side of the horizon, or close enough to it that she could feel the temperature change, and she had come back from that with a rearranged sense of what deserved her attention and what did not. She had less patience for the things that had always been marginal, the small politics of appearances, the careful hedging of positions, the performance of certainty in situations where certainty was not actually available. She had more patience for the things that mattered, which were mostly people. The specific and individual people in front of her, with their specific and individual lives, carrying what they were carrying and managing as best they could, and grateful, most of them, for a moment of genuine attention from someone who was actually paying it. George and Charlotte and Louis were growing. This is stated not as a biographical footnote, but as a thing that William and Catherine were aware of with a particular quality of attention, the awareness that the children were watching, as children always watch, and absorbing what they saw. They were watching their parents move through difficulty. They were watching their mother recover. They were watching their father learn things in public that most people only learn in private. They were watching two people navigate extraordinary pressure with more honesty than had typically been available to the generations before them. What they made of all of this was, of course, their interior lives, their eventual choices, their own understanding of the role they were being raised to step into one day. But the household they were growing up in was one in which the difficult things were talked about, in which feelings were not managed into silence, in which the adults in their lives were visibly doing the work of remaining honest with themselves and each other. Whatever they inherited from that, it was not nothing. There is a version of this story that wants to end with a declaration, with some statement of arrival, of two people who have found their way through and emerged into clarity, who have figured out what they are doing and why, and can now proceed with confidence. But that version would not be true, and one of the things that made that afternoon in the community hall so affecting was precisely that William and Catherine did not offer that version of themselves or their story. They offered the real version, which does not have a clean ending because it is not over, because real things are not over, because the work of being honest, of staying connected, of using what you have in service of something that matters, that work does not arrive at a point of completion. It just continues. Day after day, in the spaces between the duties and the engagements and the formal obligations, in the conversations that happen in kitchens, and in the quiet of late evenings, and in the car on the way back from somewhere that turned out to matter more than anyone had expected. It continues in the small and the large and the undramatic ordinary run of a life that happens to be also a public life, and in the sustained, patient, imperfect, genuine effort to make the two things inhabit each other with more grace than they sometimes naturally manage. That is what stepping forward together looked like for the first time ever in the fullest sense of the phrase. Not a coronation, not a ceremony, not a moment of choreographed symbolism. Just two people, a husband and a wife, a king and a queen, a man who grew up carrying loss and a woman who learned courage from illness, choosing to be seen as what they actually were. And in that choosing, offering something to the country they were born to serve that turned out to be more valuable than anything they had offered from behind the careful distance of a fully managed life. They offered the truth of themselves, and the country, in its quieter and more private heart, recognized it and was grateful.